Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Public and Society podcast Earth Day episode. I'm Kate. I'm a research executive in the Energy and Environment team in Public Affairs at Ipsos. We're joined today by Dr. Katherine Steentjes and Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh from the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or CAST, who'll be sharing their reactions and reflections to our latest climate research. Before we hear from our lovely guests, I thought I'd quickly just run through the research that we'll be discussing. So every year at Ipsos, we run a global survey which looks to understand citizens' concerns, attitudes and beliefs around climate change. So at the start of this year, we interviewed more than 21,000 people from 29 different markets. So it's really exciting to have some fresh data to dive into today. We'll also be touching on some other data sources as well. Let's get into it. So the theme for today's discussion will be kind of around climate change, just transition, and this idea of what is fair when we're transitioning. So just to kind of contextualize this a little bit, as we know, climate change is a key crisis facing the UK and the rest of the world. In the news just this week, I don't know if you've seen, there's been some pretty not fun stuff. So I don't know if you saw yesterday that scientists, and actually sincere apologies, I suspect we might be using that as a catch-all throughout this conversation. So sorry to any ologists listening, you're doing a wonderful job. So scientists have said that last summer's heatwave and drought in Europe were record-breaking and significantly higher than they have been in previous years. For reference, these heatwaves killed over 20,000 people and resulted in numerous crops failing. There's heatwaves at the moment in Asia too, and of course there were those kind of devastating floods in Pakistan last year. So obviously we need to do things quite quickly, but at least there's reasons to be optimistic that there is a policy imperative and people do seem to think that they need to make changes. But kind of getting into the data that we've got, so one of the things that we asked people was what they thought of their country's leadership when it came to climate change. And only a third globally thought that their government had a clear plan in place to address climate change. This is even lower in the UK, and it's down by about 10 percentage points from last year when 4 in 10 Brits thought the government had a clear plan. So starting with you, Lorraine, are you surprised that this figure is so low, or does it reflect what we're hearing?
Yeah, I'm not very surprised, actually. In actual fact, what scientists have shown is that there is a gap between the commitments by countries to reduce emissions to get to 1.5 degrees and actually achieving that. And there's another gap between those commitments that have started to be made and actually implementing anything. So in actual fact, the public are completely right. And even within the UK, Green Alliance has done some analysis showing that there are only policies covering 28% of the required emission reductions for reaching net zero in this country. So the public are basically not wrong when they say their governments don't have a very clear plan in place to tackle climate change, and the same is the case in the UK. So we are off where we need to be, and the level of ambition is not where it needs to be.
Shall I just add to that? So I also think it's quite interesting. You just mentioned, Kate, the information about scientists speaking out in the media and kind of pointing out the realities of climate change and also what we need to do, and that we need to do quite a lot quickly. And I think that has been made more aware, I think, in the last few years as well. Scientists have been speaking up more and kind of pushing their information to the public and to the politicians. So again, I'm also would say I'm not surprised, because I think through that kind of more dominant voice from scientists, it kind of showcases or demonstrates more the divergence between what's agreed on at the moment and what we actually should be doing. So I think that's been pointed out more.
Maybe just one other thought quickly is that actually this also contrasts with other issues like COVID. So the public, in some research we did, basically inferred the severity of the risk of COVID from the governmental response. So the fact that the government had never put in place lockdowns before sent a signal to the public that this is a really serious issue. And so people thought, oh my God, we really need to take this seriously. And that was part of the reason that they were sort of willing to actually play a part in tackling that risk. And they don't see the same level of response to climate change. They very clearly say, well, if it was really serious, surely the government would be doing more. So there is this kind of, if the government are not sending really clear signals that that it's a big issue through the policies they put in place, the public will not think that there is an issue. So I think it is really important that the government shows more visible leadership.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting around kind of the contrast between government response to COVID versus the environment, and how that informs how urgent people think about it. I mean, generally speaking, what do people feel about climate policies?
I mean, in terms of policy, I mean, just picking up on the urgency that, Lorraine just mentioned, and you as well, Kate, is, people still do think that climate change is very urgent, right? So despite that, which is, I think, even more remarkable, that despite the kind of clear leadership, people are demanding more action and more leadership, right? So they would like to see politicians do more, because there is a worry about climate change. This worry also has not been dampened by things like like COVID. So that, obviously other issues at the moment also very prevalent, and there's a lot of things that people are rightfully concerned about, but there's still that worry about what's going on with climate change, so that hasn't gone away, and I think people do really urgently want to see some action, because they what we see from our data and from Ipsos data is that people really are concerned. They see the impact, they see that we really drastically need to change things quite fundamentally, and I think that it's just that lack of leadership at the moment. How are we really going to achieve that? And I guess speaking to the policies, I think there's a range of quite strong support for some things. There's obviously not generally all climate change policies are supported blindly. There's always obviously concerns, especially at the moment when people are really worried about how to pay for the essentials in their life. So I think that definitely, once you go into the real policies, there are more caveats and how people feel about that.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, I think through the work that CAST and Ipsos have been doing together to poll the public around attitudes to climate policies, that work, the net zero living work, really does show, broadly speaking, a lot of public support for the sorts of climate policies we need, and which will involve lifestyle change as well. So things like frequent flyer levies, for example, around 2/3 of the public saying they support that. Not too much less, around 60% saying they would support changing product pricing to reflect how environmentally friendly products are. And while there are some policies like taxing red meat and maybe creating sort of low traffic neighbourhoods, which are rather lower levels of support, even those are not far off, around 50% actually. So even though those are a bit more contentious. And yes, it's true that once you add in some of the caveats around, well, it could cost you more and it could create some inconvenience to you, that does mean that support drops a bit. But actually, a lot of these policies, particularly the ones where they're seen to be fairer, they tend to retain quite reasonable levels of support.
And I mean, thinking about policies that would necessitate behaviour change and things like that, I think we do see people are somewhat willing to change their behaviours. So we have seen that in some of the Earth Day polling. So I think it was 7 in 10 people said that they thought that if everyone did make small changes in their life, it would have a really big impact. And similarly, I think 6 in 10, so 2/3, also said that they thought they needed to act now, otherwise they'd be failing future generations. So there is kind of the imperative and the desire to act and a belief in individual behaviour changes. But kind of thinking about those individual behaviour changes, I think we do quite often see that we can run into a bit of a problem around people's understanding of the impact of these behaviour changes. So every year Ipsos does a study called the Perils of Perception, and we included some questions around that in the Earth Day polling as well. And we have seen over the last few years a pretty persistent believe true gap, which essentially refers to citizens' misconceptions about what is most effective versus the reality of what actually is the most effective action. So people tend to overestimate actions that have less impact, and underestimate actions that have more impact. So, I mean, for example, people tend to overestimate the impact of actions like recycling or using less packaging, while underestimating impacts of actions like having a vegan diet or changing how they get around, what transport they use. Obviously, all are quite important, but it's quite interesting that we do see that kind of consistent thread of thinking certain things are more impactful than others. Where do you think those misconceptions might be coming from?
I think a lot of it probably comes from the sorts of campaigns that people have been exposed to over the last several decades, really. Environmental and behaviour change campaigns that tend to focus on encouraging people to recycle, to maybe switch off lights and appliances that they're not using. So quite small scale behaviour changes that people can very easily do around the home and sort of feel like they're doing their bit. And the emphasis has really been on it's sort of small and painless things. You really don't need to change your lifestyle very substantially. And I think some of that comes from a place of policymakers not necessarily wanting to ask too much of the electorate and feeling like it would be very unpopular if they asked people to substantially change their lifestyles. And while people do sometimes resist very significant amounts of change, there is a sort of a bias towards the status quo. As you've said, actually, there is quite high willingness to change behaviour. And I think a lot of the sorts of things that we need to do, like change travel habits and change diets and so on, that we are already seeing people starting to change those behaviours and express a willingness to change them more. So I think there is actually more public support to make those sorts of changes than policymakers would suspect.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that came out of this data as well, doesn't it? So, and also some of our data before that, when we look at businesses and governments and people, which I guess are kind of three of the things that really need to change, people do see responsibility with all three. They see the responsibility with themselves, around 60%, with the businesses, but also with government. And only government is maybe people see as slightly more responsible. But I think it's also important, as Lorraine just said, like people still are aware that their own actions also need to be part of this. So it's all, looking at all three of those things, as that can or need to change or be part of the change, really. So yeah, I agree. I think people are generally more willing to accept that, and just maybe even asking for, I guess that I think that's also coming out of the data, right? That they're almost asking for more information and more more direction of, but what can I do about this? How can I direct my worry in an efficient way to, as an outlet to deal with this? And I think some things are quite good are starting to change, I think. So for one example, when we think about meat consumption, for example, I think only a few years ago, that wasn't really on people's radar at all, how what we eat actually contributes to climate change, whereas I do feel that conversation has moved on a bit, that at least there is an awareness now for the products we buy, the foods we eat, and that there are different choices that have different implications for the carbon emissions associated with that.
Yeah, I think we've seen it maybe with flying as well. I think that's people are much more aware of the impact of flying on climate change.
Can I just jump in there with the flying thing? Like, I also think it's really interesting when we think, for example, those connections that have been made, and also again in the media. So when we think, for example, about famous people such as political leaders or members of the royal family, and then they have been occasionally scrutinized by their hypocrisy, on the one hand caring about climate change, on the other hand taking private jets for short distances, which I think is quite interesting, that has again kind of come to a level of public discourse that's actually has been scrutinized and pointed out that those things don't really match up.
And I mean, I guess thinking about that, so I mean, kind of talking about hypocrisy, potentially amongst, or people seeing hypocrisy with governments relating to kind of private jets, for example, and climate change. part of what we found in Earth Day was that kind of roughly a third of citizens said that having easy access to information on the steps they can take every day would be an effective way to help them make changes. And this was kind of the second most popular way to motivate them to make changes, behind incentives, which we can touch on a little bit later. So kind of thinking about the believe true gap, and there's more awareness, but not necessarily full awareness, I guess, or kind of a full understanding. Who do you think, or how do you think we can get those messages out there, and who would be a good messenger for them?
I mean, I think there is evidence on this. So, for example, Climate Outreach have done some polling asking the public who they would see as the most trusted messengers around climate change. And as you might not be surprised to hear, David Attenborough is universally trusted. So he's certainly considered a trustworthy communicator. Similarly, climate scientists and environmental charities are seen as trustworthy. But interestingly, also, ordinary people who've been affected by climate change are also seen as very trustworthy, credible communicators, and they bring home the reality of climate change in a way that maybe other communicators don't necessarily. So actually seeing people and communities who have been flooded, for example, or affected by extreme weather in other ways can actually be really powerful to communicate the reality of climate change and how to respond and what sort of action to take. There are differences across different segments in terms of who people trust. For example, people on the right of centre and sort of conservatives, for example, more traditional voters have said that they trust climate scientists rather less than other groups. They place more trust in royals, for example, than other segments. So there are differences, but I think there are certainly some groups that enjoy more trust than others.
It's really interesting, actually, around people trusting others' experiences. That was also something that we found in the Earth Day data. I think it was the third highest thing that would motivate people to kind of make changes in their lifestyles relating to climate change was hearing or seeing the impact of climate change at home. It's perhaps rather less so for other countries, seeing the impacts in other countries. But I mean, thinking about kind of at home and how we can make behaviour changes and how climate change relates to how we live our everyday lives, I think it's really important to talk about the current economic context. So times at the moment are really tough for a lot of people. I think it was just over a third of Brits in the Earth Day research agreed that right now is not the right time to invest in climate change, given the tough economic conditions. Third did disagree with that. They did think it was the right time, and the other third were kind of in the middle. But yeah, we did have quite strong division over whether or not now is the right time to act, given economic conditions. But it's important to note too that a third also said they would be willing to pay more tax to help prevent climate change, and more did think that the impact of climate change would be more expensive than the efforts to reduce it, just ignoring it. So long-term people value it, but I think in the current economic context it's really difficult for people to think about it in that way. And so, but given the urgency of change that we kind of discussed at the beginning, how do you think we can reconcile that?
Yeah, shall I make a start? So I think it is a concern, and it's something that needs to be thought about, like considerably. And I think it's important to really look at people's current situation and, take those financial concerns very seriously. So it's not even, I don't think it's necessarily a very helpful narrative to imply that responding to climate change or addressing, reducing our emissions is actually costing us a lot. I know this is often portrayed like that, and obviously you're not saying it's not associated with costs, but there are also costs hidden in maintaining our status quo, right? So there are costs there. There's money in taxes going around and still being put maybe in, into things that are not addressing climate change. So I think it's also to really carefully unpack that and have a closer look, and not simply saying, okay, if we address climate change we need to increase taxes, right? So and I think, again, I'm not saying this is going to be an easy thing to do, but I also think, you know, there are certain things that can do two things in one go. So we have seen that, you know, people are very supportive in policies that improve the insulation of the home, for example, or, you know, have to do with heating their house and addressing, you know, the costs of that, obviously. So and we do identify kind of measures that could address both of those things at the same time. Insulating is always a good thing. It's also a good thing to, you know, have a warmer house and do that in a cheaper way. The petrol prices have gone up. People are really worried about that. If we really systematically change, you know, our cars and how we transport, then that can actually lead to people paying less for their fuel in the future. You know, there are things that actually can relieve pressure from people's financial concerns and also address climate change at the same time. So I think it's just really focusing on those first, I assume. I'm sure Lorraine has also some thoughts to add to that.
I think you covered that really well, Kat. I mean, all I'd add is that I think the data from our polling bears out a lot of that, because with the Net Zero Living report, for example, on where the policy of changing product pricing to reflect the environmental impact, when we talked about this would mean that some things would cost more, that actually there was no reduction in support for that, because the way in which the policy was worded was that low carbon products will be cheaper, basically. So there is still an element of choice that you can choose low carbon products and you will actually be financially rewarded for that. And you can simply just avoid the higher carbon products that are costing you more. So I think where there are sort of economic wins and you can actually save money and there is an element of choice, I think that means that people will support that. And so people can sort of see that it isn't necessarily the case that they're going to be out of pocket, and they will support where there are those win-wins, basically. I think it's also important that we think about this sort of cost thing more widely and sort of think about the just transition. So again, public perceptions are in favour of where those more economically disadvantaged by climate change and climate change policies, so people working in high carbon sectors, for example, are protected. They policies that protect those groups are more supported by the public. So I think that, again, it does come back a lot to fairness as part of what's driving perceptions.
And I think that's also an opportunity, right? So again, it's not really so much about making things even harder, especially for the people who are already suffering. It's quite the opposite. And I think there's also, you know, policies can be framed and adjusted in a certain way to really make that clear that maybe the people who are not as affected and not as suffering as much, if you know, like, would actually support quite fair policies, even, you know, if that means they're maybe not benefiting, or, you know, maybe asking to pay slightly more than other, you know, there are ways around that, because what we see from people is always, as Lorraine said, is affordability for everyone is always a concern for people. So if that's kind of communicated of why certain policies are kind of maybe supporting people and, you know, who are already struggling a bit more than others, then, you know, I think that there could also be a support for that more generally.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm quite glad you mentioned, Kat, the kind of dichotomy that we have or the narrative that we have in our heads around you can't have a good economy and address climate change at the same time. It's kind of, I think that narrative is quite prolific, and it's not necessarily always fair, or it's not necessarily reflective of reality. I mean, for example, we did some polling, I think in August 2022, which found that of a kind of a list of environmentally friendly behaviour changes that we asked the public about, quite a few of them, which included kind of turning their heating down by 1 or 2 degrees, where it's still comfortable but it's reduced a little bit, doing more insulating and kind of driving less, walking more, that kind of thing. Those were all done motivated by the fact that they would save them money, but they're also very environmentally friendly behaviours to have, so long as obviously we don't want people being uncomfortable in their homes because they're too cold and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's really interesting, the kind of that narrative is so prolific.
Yeah, just to, I guess, add to that, because I think there's actually a third point that maybe is kind of implied, but maybe doesn't get as much attention. So obviously, it's, you know, people, you're talking about cost, and there's a good economy, and we can address climate change. But I think what's almost more important is to say, okay, we can address climate change and still live a happy life, right? Because I think that's more important, and but that's kind of what people mean with living in a healthy economy. So I think, you know, maybe if we kind of talk about that a little bit more, and it's like, what does it really mean to have a fulfilled and happy life? Which obviously one of that aspect is to not worry about whether you can afford food on the table, but then there are also other things, right, in terms of our interaction with nature, or, you know, how we get around, or that we do live in a society that is, you know, equal and fair, and, you know, and I think that there are more aspects to that than just the economic ones, which I think should not be forgotten about in that discussion as well. I think
that's probably quite a nice and more positive way of thinking about behavior changes relating to climate change, because I think outside of that, you can potentially, you know, people are struggling, and then you're adding, well, we should be doing stuff about climate change, which could result in kind of climate anxiety, or just this feeling of existential dread, which I felt, I'm sure others have felt as well. But thinking about kind of the particular behaviours that people can take, what kind of things can people do, and can these be cheaper? As we've kind of mentioned, there's a few, but are there any others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some good work to by the Cred Centre, for example, that has calculated the most effective things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. And the top one is to live car free. That reduces your carbon footprint by over 2 tons of CO2 per year. And to put that in context, we need to get from an average 8.5 tons per person to 2.5 tons in the next 7 years. So a huge change to our lifestyles. So if you were to give up your car entirely, then the average person would save, a couple of tons. Switching to an electric vehicle would be almost as good. Obviously, this is assuming that the power is coming from renewable sources. But other sorts of things besides transport include changing your diet, so cutting down on red meat and dairy in particular, thinking about energy in the home, so having a renewable energy source like a heat pump, and insulating your home. Those sorts of things are really effective, because space heating is one of the biggest generators of a carbon footprint. And then there's sort of consumption more widely, so how much stuff we buy, because there's lots of embedded energy there, so being less wasteful as well. I guess more generally, there are behaviours that we can take outside of the home as well. And so we're not only consumers, we're also citizens, so we can support policies, we can call for policies or protest, we can do things in the workplace, so we can change things hopefully at work, or put pressure on our managers at work to do more. And there are things we can do within our communities as well, and just sort of have an influence on the people around us in lots of different ways. So there's a whole range of things that we can do to change our behaviour.
Yeah, and I think just one example I always quite like that is it called climate packs? Is that right? So so that is just one example of how businesses, for example, can promote that. So there is an initiative that tries to so basically when employees take low carbon travel on holiday, that they then get extra annual leave to be allowed, to kind of make up for that, because normally like taking a long distance train obviously does take longer than flying somewhere. So it's just those little things, I think, that could kind of help making those decisions, because and it's really like trying to identify those barriers of that, I think. And also, generally speaking, I think it's more of a general thing, I think, like also for all of us in all our roles, to really think about climate change and how we can kind of feed that into all those little decisions that we make. Is it like where we go on holiday? Is it, where to hold certain conferences, whether maybe, it's an idea to hold them closer to where people are, and things like that. So I think there are a lot of practical little things that everyone could easily get on board with. And I think it's kind of almost like a general underlying motivation potentially to develop that, to really look at what can I do. And I think also what was unhelpful to really kind of think about, oh, everyone needs to do this one thing and then we're all sorted, right? So it's more, we all need to do as much as we can on those all of those little things. But I think that's also in a way quite motivating, because then it's not so much about one shoe fits all, but we all need to really think about our lives in the way that we live it and wherever we can reduce our carbon footprints.
And what about how we can encourage those kind of behaviours?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is that, well, information alone is not going to do it. So it is important to educate people, inform people about what they can do to be most effective. As we've already heard from your Perils of Perception research, people think that recycling is really effective. In actual fact, it reduces your carbon footprint by about 0.01 tonnes of CO2. And remember, we have to get from 8.5 tonnes to 2.5 tonnes. So it's pretty small in the grand scheme of things, and yet it's the top thing that people mention when they say, you know, what they're doing to tackle climate change. So there is a big education piece that information can help with. But what we also know is that there are barriers to behaviour change, that even when people are informed about what they can do, they often find it difficult or expensive or inconvenient or socially unusual to do, which means that there are reasons why people just don't end up doing it. So there's often a gap between what people say or want to do and what they actually do. So the sorts of things that you need to put in place include kind of economic policies to reduce the costs of low carbon products and services, as well as kind of regulatory and infrastructural changes that mean that it's much easier to do the right thing, so that there's more availability of the sorts of products and services, that those are the default, that are the low carbon options, because people like kind of the easy option. So make it easy for people is the top thing, and a lot of that comes down to the right policies to actually make low carbon choices the natural one.
And I also think it's quite interesting. So looking at that data, that 19% of people said that they, you know, would change their behaviours when they see other people's family and friends, which 19% maybe sounds like quite low, but we also know from research that people are actually not really good at identifying when those kind of social norms affect their behavior. So in reality, I would expect that number actually to be higher, and that, you know, people's behaviors are shaped quite a lot by what loved ones around us do, like the conversations that we have. And I think on the flip side, that also means that, you know, it's really important to have those conversations with friends and family, you know, and kind of, you know, like not shy away from that, even though maybe sometimes those conversations can be quite uncomfortable if you suddenly start to question, oh, why did you not take the train? That's actually way more fun, you know, and it's way better for the climate. Like, why do you have to fly, you know, like, and yeah, I don't know, there's just those conversations, I guess, you know, which is so important, I think, to really create that kind of those conversations, and not in a nasty way, but in a kind of supportive way. And I think that's the way that we also change those social norms that are quite important in shaping a lot of these behaviors.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, I mean, for example, if I'll go out to eat with friends and if all my friends are getting something vegan, I'm much more likely, I think, to go for a plant-based option over a maybe meat-based option that I might have gotten if there wasn't that, I guess, social pressure-ish to do it in that way. I mean, so that's kind of quite individual, or I guess socially based. So in the Earth Day polling, we also asked people about different other stakeholders, so kind of government stakeholders, the role of government and the role of businesses, and how much responsibility they have, as well as individuals. And we found it was pretty consistent. It was kind of 6 and 10, 6 and 10, 6 and 10, so 2/3 for all of them, with slightly more responsibility for government. So what do you both think about the responsibility for different stakeholders? I think we've spoken a bit about government policies, so maybe what about businesses? What role do they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the public is sort of right in the sense that it is a shared responsibility, that you cannot have a social transformation or transition without the public, government and businesses playing a role together. because we need, as we've talked about, we need the policies in place to make it easier for people to do the right thing. So that's about kind of economic measures, regulation, etc., that make it easy for the public to take action. But equally, a lot of those things will also put pressure on businesses or motivate and incentivize businesses to invest in low carbon products and services, and to then make those things available to the public. So the role of business is there. I mean, as behavioural insights team sort of talk about upstream, midstream and downstream, and sort of all of these sort of different actors have to play a role, and business is sort of in the midstream, and that they're creating enabling environments for a lot of people, for consumers to make the choices that they do within a consumer context. So it's crucial that they are providing the sorts of products and services that we need at an affordable price, and that they are available and so on. So, but government in turn has to be making that sort of easy and attractive for businesses as well. So there's a sort of relationships across all those three groups, I would say.
And we also see a bit of a shift there, right? In businesses, even existing businesses, kind of having like sustainable clothing lines now, you know, so kind of pushing their kind of credentials on that front. And I mean, of course, we need to be a bit careful. Sometimes there is a bit of what we call greenwashing going on. But at the same time, I think it's good to see that kind of push that's also kind of matching the demand from people. It's like people do want to be kind of more ethical consumers in a lot of ways, and that's then shaping how businesses respond to that. So I think that's really, really encouraging. And I guess we also already mentioned briefly that the businesses, it's one in terms of products and services they sell. The other thing is how they kind of implement their own internal organizational strategies. And that covers a lot of things, you know, and with regards to employees, with regards to their own waste strategy, for example, as well as the products they sell and services, I guess.
Yeah, maybe making it, convenience and cost, I guess. So making it so it's the automatic option, which might necessitate some government intervention on regulation and that kind of thing, to kind of get that roll off the ground. Yeah, that's super interesting. So I mean, the last topic that I wanted to talk about is kind of extrapolating all of this out. We've been talking quite generally about the UK, really, I think, so nationally, and also looking at kind of quite micro level individual behaviours. But another key component of the challenge is the global aspect of it all. And so I mean, we mentioned fairness around encouraging people who maybe have less, or how can we make it fair for people who have less to be able to make positive environmental changes in their behaviours, and how can we facilitate that? There's also kind of a global issue around fairness as well. I think, Lorraine, you mentioned the just transition, but globally that's kind of also a much bigger issue, in that many of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change and are most vulnerable to the impact it will have are also countries that are less economically developed and have less money, and have historically also contributed less to the challenge. So we did find in the Earth Day research that most globally, pretty much everyone agrees that developed countries are doing the most, and that they should be doing the most, and that historically those that have contributed more should be paying more now as well, although that agreement was slightly lower amongst markets that have historically contributed more, and would be the ones contributing more, like the US, Japan, and the UK and Canada as well. But yeah, kind of just quite a general question, I guess. What do you think of that, and how can we make it fair on a global stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is interesting. I guess what we know from the research on this, and on sort of public acceptance of policies more generally, is that fairness is such an important consideration, that policies that are seen to be fair tend to be much more supported, and there's sort of lots of aspects of fairness. But at the same time, while people support policies that are fair, they do also take into consideration the cost and the impact on themselves personally. And so where you see some of those interesting differences between the markets, and that there's probably that tension between, yes, I accept that I live in a a developed country that's responsible for more of the carbon pollution, but equally I sort of don't really relish the idea of having to massively change my lifestyle. So I think there's always a bit of that tension that goes on in terms of when people express support or not for different climate policies. But we know fairness certainly is a really big part of what people want and would support in terms of policies, and there are different elements of that, I think. And so, yeah, sort of in terms of different countries, in terms of different sectors and people that work, for example, as we talked about in high carbon sectors and not leaving them behind, different generations as well. So there are sort of different elements that people do to some extent, I think, factor in to their thinking.
Just to talk about the kind of global aspect of this, I mean, I think what maybe is not, the fact that a couple of years ago internationally it was agreed between countries that we want to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. There was a reason for that decision, right? To say 1.5, and why 1.5, which sounds maybe to non-scientists sounds like, oh, it's not even that much, but it was just that was chosen because that was deemed the maximum temperature increase where the kind of global impacts would still be seen as kind of morally defendable and morally fair, whereas everything beyond that would have just massive implication for some parts of the world that just wasn't really politically defendable in the sense. So I think that's something that almost is not really talked about as much. So that kind of global responsibility, and I think it's somewhat there, but I'm not really saying like people like, or it's obviously always easier to think about your immediate environment, about your nation, and kind of especially if you have a lot of things to worry about yourself. So again, I think it's almost a bit more of a responsibility of our leadership to really be truthful and honest about what that means and what the kind of our national emissions and maybe falling short of those ambitions that their country has made, what that means globally, right? So, and I think there is always every couple of years when the kind of global leaders get together, then that's the only time that is really talked about, and then it kind of gets some attention. But I do think that it would be good to kind of make that kind of moral aspect of what this means globally for many countries a bit more dominant in that discussion, I think. And it has been like coming out a bit through the kind of school strikes and some of those young leaders that have gained popularity who really push that agenda. And I think that is something that is really important. And it's not so much just about the national ambitions, but it's also, what that means globally.
I think as well, kind of what you were saying about 1.5 degrees, I think people who aren't, I guess, you just don't work in the space or are a little bit less well informed, they hear 1.5 degrees and they're like, oh, that's not that much. That how bad could that possibly be, really? And obviously it's like that's as bad as it can get, and then after that it becomes, as you say, politically and morally quite indefensible to let it get any further. Yeah, so that's been a really interesting discussion. I guess just to wrap everything up, do either of you have any kind of summarizing thoughts about what we've spoken about, or any final messages or anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to?
I mean, I just think there's so much in this data that really reinforces the fact that the public get climate change and that they really want action, and that they're not really seeing sufficient action. And that's also clear from a lot of the policy analysis, that there really isn't enough action. And they want to play a part, but they need governments to enable them to do that. So I think this is kind of just the latest sort of data point, really, that kind of reinforces this view that we need to help the public play a role in tackling climate change, and there's a lot of support there. So I feel like this, if there was any doubt that governments had that the public is not on board, this hopefully helps address that.
I mean, that would have been a good point to leave it, but I just want to just say one more thing, I guess, that I haven't really mentioned, is really that, what we see in our data as well, that a lot of people, like around 65%, is really kind of concerned about going forward, about the future. You know, the last few years that we had, I think, have kind of raised some kind of general anxiety for a lot of people with regards to COVID, you know, the Ukrainian war, like that people are kind of uncertain about what's going to happen. And I think it's really important to not just consider that, but then also really be truthful about the future that we are facing, because there will be more interruptive events, and you know, also changing and decarbonizing our lifestyles won't just be easy on all levels. So I think, you know, it's better to be truthful and honest about that, obviously also kind of showing ways of how that can be done. And I think that there are a lot of things that we already talked about that are very doable, and that, you know, that give reason to really be hopeful. But I think it always has to be coming from a really open, honest place. And I think that, and just one other thing, I think also we talked a lot about behaviors and what people can do, but I think in general it's really important to prepare ourselves and kind of put ourselves in as a society in the best way to kind of deal with that. So for example, also looking at social support networks, you know, what are people's worries at the moment, what are their concerns, how can we strengthen their kind of confidence in being optimistic about the future. And again, I do think that can be a vision that can be positive and can be hopeful in terms of where we want to head. So I think that just has to be shaped a bit more and kind of talked about a bit more, I think.
I mean, definitely, yeah. We've got I think a lot of our data is also showing people are just very uncertain about the future and about kind of the direction of the country and where we're going and how we can get to a place where people feel better, and absolutely about the kind of, you know, this data reinforcing this desire for change and this desire for there to be quite strong leadership. And I agree with the kind of the transparent leadership as well. You know, our data is also showing that there's not very much confidence in government at the moment. There's not very much trust. So kind of potentially having that kind of strong leadership about something that people are very anxious about, but want to do something about, I think is, yeah, really both really good points about how we can turn this around and help people out. So thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting conversation. And yeah, if you want to follow our social medias and follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts, that'd be great as well. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah, see you soon.